Welcome to Ankrans and Radio G presents Techniche Interviews 2017, a conversation with Mike Morasky, a music composer at Valve Corporations. Not only that, he has also been a visual effects director for movies like The Lord of the Rings, The Matrix Saga, and Pirates of the Caribbean, The Dead Man's Chest, if I'm not wrong.
Yeah,
right?
yeah, that's
okay.
right.
And many more. He's like
I mean,
amazing.
I wouldn't say director. Yeah, but that's okay.
Okay, technical director.
Yeah. There you go.
Anyway, other than that, he's also been a part of a lot of rock bands in his past. So we have a rock star in the house. A lot of people here, the rock culture, the music, it's something which India has always been interested in, and it's moving to the Western culture. We've been influenced by the Western culture. We are inspired by the Western culture, and we have a person who's all throughout his life, he's been working in music and in visual effects. So before we get into the details of what all you've done, right now, what exactly, so that people get an idea of, what exactly is the job of a music composer at a video game company as big as Valve?
Well, Valve is organized really uniquely. I don't know if you know about it, but we have no managers. And so pretty much everybody that we hire has a broad skill set. And so the way we work, everybody has to kind of choose what they work on and the way they work on it. And I've been there 12 years now. So typically I try to just be as useful as possible, right? It's not like some companies where all I would do is write music all day. That would be great, but it's not very useful necessarily. And so sometimes, like earlier this summer, I was working on a project that will come out, could be next week. It's Valve time, so who knows? But it'll be out sometime soon. And so I spent a month just writing music and doing mixing and that kind of thing. And then went into the studio and recorded a full orchestra. And so that's super fun. But then I do a lot of other stuff too. Just like everybody there fills the role that makes the most sense at the time. And so lately I've been working on a new project and helping with some other ones just in small ways. But there's a new one coming up that hopefully I get to dig into soon and really, sometimes I like to just do little things, and sometimes I like to really dig in and get busy, you know.
For people who don't know, Sir has also done the music composition for games like Team Fortress 2, Portal 2, Left 4 Dead 2, and 1. So such iconic musics, because I, as a gamer myself, when after the Valve logo hits and after that the Team Fortress music hits, it's that kind of music which will get you pumped up.
Right.
So
right.
how does the process go? How do you go about such a process where you need to know that from a gamer's perspective what they want to listen, what they want to hear, what is going to trigger them and keep them going?
Right. Yeah. Well, I mean, Team Fortress is an easy one in a way for me because the design is so beautiful, and the characters are so interesting and deep. Right. I started at Valve originally to work on the SFM, which is the tool we use to make the animated shorts. You know, the Meet the Team, like Meet the Medic, Meet the, and so. Most of the music that plays at the beginning of Team Fortress is actually music from the shorts. And so designing music for those characters and for that world and sort of the story there is really easy in a way. There's just a lot of beauty and inspiration there. But at the same time, from the beginning, I really put a lot of energy into the design of the music and what we call a Bible, right? It's a design Bible, not a real Bible, but like it's sort of a set of rules and concepts that you use to then guide how the music is built. And one of them really is sort of a high energy feeling, right? The core of it, the core of that game and the core of the characters and the design is sort of like a 60s cool, but also kind of crazy, just a little over
a bit over the top.
Everything's a little over the top, right? And so that's, I pretty much always, when we're talking about starting a game or you're going into a round or something, I almost always am aiming for the pump up, like the getting excited. unless it's scary, like Left 4 Dead. But in this particular case, I think sort of everything about Team Fortress is pretty exciting.
Yeah.
Even the kind of sad, quiet music, it's still pretty. There's something about it that has some energy.
Yeah.
So,
coming to that exactly, of the three major games, like which everyone knows, the Left 4 Dead series, Team Fortress, and Portal. The type of music in these games are so different. Where Team Fortress is that pumped up, high energy music.
Right.
Left 4 Dead, completely opposite, where it has to be dark. It needs to feel like it needs to make you scared.
Yeah.
And then there's Portal, which is that the serenity is there, which still needs to make you feel curious. It's very different aspects about it. So when you're going to make a production, like when you're going to make the music, how exactly do you differentiate between such things and realize this is what signifies it giving that emotion?
Yeah, there's a bunch of different answers to that. In those three cases, I think the way I compose and the way I tend to think about things is very conceptual, like a designer. I think very much like a designer. So first, I'm going to look at the visuals, right, and the sort of the story and the symbolism of the game, and try and accent that. But I'm also really thinking about let's say, if you're going to make the trailer, right? What works for the trailer? Like if you put the right thing with the trailer, then when people see the trailer, they'll see the visuals, they'll hear the music, and then when they come to the game, it should all tie into a bigger statement, sort of. And then there's kind of the underlying thing, like with Team Fortress, they're all the characters are a little bit broken, and they're a little crazy. So it's this high energy, but I force, let's say, a trumpet player to play out of tune, but he's going to play a little sharp, right? He's going to play hot. Whereas Left 4 Dead, I'll do the opposite, right? Because Left 4 Dead, it's sad because it's humans who are sick. They're not they're monsters, but they're humans. And so the whole story there is kind of like it's broken too, but it's dark and it's slower. So, you might have a brass section, and I'll get them to play out of tune, but they'll play flat, right? So, and maybe a little slow and a little out that way. But Left 4 Dead's an interesting one because originally, when I was working on it, I played everything very serious. I was playing everything kind of more to the nature of horror, right? Okay. So action and horror, like real kind of more traditional horror, which there are still some components there. I definitely look to 70s B horror films, right? Because it's not like a A-list horror film. It's kind of a B horror film. And zombie films usually are kind of that 70s. I mean, to my, historically speaking, are 70s kind of B. And so I designed around that. But as we worked on the game and played with it, I noticed that the game's really funny, right? Like you just get all these things happen so fast, and people like are laughing, and they, when they get pounced or something, you let go of the controls, and so I wanted to counter the humor with some sadness, right? Which also goes with the sick humans, and I mean, not to be too serious, and then Portal is that's also an interesting one that was really influenced by the gameplay itself. But there's this sort of in Portal 1, the first half is the white kind of 70s style laboratory, and the music is very 70s ambient, right? Like Brian Eno, kind of a little darker than Eno would normally do, but of that style. And so when you go behind the scenes, and it turns into the rusty metal and whatnot, and by then GLaDOS is your enemy. Right? I really hit the kind of 80s. It was sort of the future of the 70s, and then future of the 80s, which is a little more, kind of Blade Runner-esque, right? But both of them have that's sort of everything I do, at least in those three games that you're talking about, have sort of a conceptual design that borrows from history, like musical history, but then I also make it new, make sure it's always new and has a modern feel. And so with Portal, I did that there, and then in Portal 2, there's also a bunch of historical music, future music of the past, right? But then Portal 2 is interesting because, everybody but Alex, or sorry, not Alex, Chell, are robots.
Yeah.
And so the music is all really electronic, and even the orchestral music is samples on purpose so that it sounds like it's artificial. Like GLaDOS could have written it, or she could have had a AI write the music, right? Except for a few cases where I purposely then make it not sound artificial.
Okay.
Yeah. Right.
So exactly, and a lot of interviews which you've done, a lot of speeches which you always say music is a form of language.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, and exactly of how these stories are being told, even in such ways of how GLaDOS artificial, it should feel artificial. It's an aspect of the story which can mildly be seen in such things. So music is a form of storytelling where it's just your ears which are playing everything.
Mm-hmm.
And then when it comes to visual effects, it's another form of storytelling which is just through the eyes. So shifting from visual effects to music, how was the transition? How what all changed, but what all is still similar about it?
Right. There's actually a lot more that's similar than you would think.
Okay.
In fact, my talk today, I talk about that quite a bit.
Okay.
The structure of creation as a creative individual, as an artist, is almost always kind of the same. The details are the part that's different, right?
Yeah.
So switching from visual effects back to music, the music part wasn't so difficult because I already knew music to a degree. But the what I call the leafy part, the details, what does the software look like? Because I hadn't really gotten new software in probably 10 years.
Mm-hmm.
I still had my gear, but relearning sort of those details. But that's sort of anybody can do that. That's just like, what's everybody using? Spend some money, learn the software. The concepts are still the same. But then it really was more about looking at and listening to a lot of existing vocabulary, meaning other music, right?
Yeah.
Music that has, John Williams or, I don't know, some of my favorites like Ennio Morricone, and looking at the juxtapositions that they use of types of music to picture, or, people say music to picture a lot, but really what I'm looking for is music to symbols. Music to story. Like, what's the story that's happening and the music that's going underneath it, and the visuals, of course, too. But it's really about that. And so I spent a lot of time doing that, and also learning a broader array of instruments, right? And how to hear them and identify, because orchestra instruments are often combinations of, say, you've got some strings with some woodwinds, right?
Yeah.
And how those sound, and how the winds affect the strings, and what sorts of techniques. Again, it's really about learning the vocabulary, the existing vocabulary, so that when you're working, you can, if you want to get, say, an alien sound, right? You might do some stacked fourths, right? Or an arpeggio of stacked fourths is, often going to kind of, that's used for a lot of different sounds, but depending on which instruments you use, but that it has a long history of vocabulary around it. And so that, again, though, that's kind of the leafy stuff. The bigger process of, say, of working on a project, for example, if you're just going to make one piece of music, let's say you have a job, and it's to make one piece of music, and here's the details, the specs and whatnot, you might kind of sit on your hands, and you have 4 weeks. You might sit on your hands for 3 weeks, and then work really hard for a week to get it done. And I certainly do a certain amount of that in general, like study and dream and think a lot about all the design and what all the, and I listen to a lot of music, and I really do that. But if you're going to do, say, a large project, like a film, and you're going to do 200 shots for a giant film, and those shots are going to take a lot of time, or a video game where you're going to do, 4 CDs worth of music, it's much better to get as much done to a certain level of quality as you can, and then you can go back, because what you do is you identify your risks, right? You identify where the problems might show up, what might like really cause you to fail, and you get rid of those risks, and you kind of see, and then you get a bigger picture too. You can kind of understand what the overall effort looks like, and then you go back and identify, the what I call the money shots, or the pieces of music that you've written well enough that they're compelling, right? And you augment those, or if you have a piece of music that's not compelling but it's in an important place, you replace it and make something better, right? Anyway, those are the things that are similar, and you would do the same with like film work or anything really. If you're doing like a big programming project, you can dig in and really go crazy on one small area, but it's probably smarter to kind of figure out the big picture and lay out the structure, and then go through, and you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Programming is a bit different because you sometimes have to spend enough time to make it work at all, right? So that's not everything, but that's kind of a rough approximation, and I talk a bunch about that today. That's my whole talk, is pretty much about that.
Talking about taking such big risks and stuff, one thing which stands out, which I knew even before playing the Left 4 Dead series, was about Midnight Riders. And that, when you know about what all you did in Midnight Riders, it's amazing to know that. Whose idea was it, and how did you execute it? Because it's fascinating to think of executing such an idea into that game,
right?
A very small aspect of it, and yet it made such a big impact.
I like that you say that. That's a really classic Valve story, right? Okay. We were working on the Dark Carnival audit, the amphitheater section, and we're kind of trying to figure out what to do to make it special. And then somebody said, "Well, let's have a band." And it's like, well, we can't put a band in there. And there, in Valve, it's all, there's nobody in charge, so everybody's just kind of throwing ideas around. And Dario Casali was working on it, who's a great level designer, has been there from the beginning at Valve, pretty much, I think. And Jeremy Bennett, the painter artist, and a handful of other people as well. And so we kind of tossed around like, oh well, let's have it. It's a fair, right? So in America, a carnival like that would have a band come play, and maybe some band that was super famous before, but now is like maybe a notch down or whatever, and it's in the South. So we kind of all converged on this idea of, almost a Lynyrd Skynyrd, Southern rock band, but we didn't want it to be that cut and dry. It's sort of like the design concept visually and musically was sort of like, let's make it a Southern rock band, but that has like a George Thorogood kind of toughness or Motorhead almost. And so we actually talked it through that way. But the funny thing is that just before that, when Chet Fauschek was recording with, I forget his name, the guy who did Coach, right? He said like, hey, we might have a band in this section, and can you sing a little bit? And I forget the lyrics that he sings, but it's the stand up to the mountain, and he sings this little snippet that's just like that much melody. I mean, it's super short, and these lyrics, and so then when we went to write the material for it, I basically had the recording of him singing that, and so I matched the tempo. I figured out what key he was in, and then wrote the verse. I think it's a verse. I haven't listened to it in forever. That's why I can't remember the lyrics. But I basically wrote the song around this little snippet of lyrics and vocalization from the Coach. Which if you play the game, he sings, and it's literally like, it's really funny. And then while we were doing that, there's Greg Dale is an old friend of mine who's a great singer, and I just thought, like, let's try him out. Like I'd heard him. his style, his personal style, is more kind of dark and brooding, But when we got into my my personal studio, I was like, okay, like, can you sing? I had a little piece of music. I was strumming on the acoustic guitar, and I was like, can you sing? But can you do it more like Motorhead? Little. And I showed him the picture of the art and whatnot, and man, he just killed it. Like, he nailed it. And then the truth is for a little while I have a friend who, I have a lot of musician friends, who has this great band called Dirty Power, and I kind of thought they might be perfect for this, but for some reason I couldn't get a hold of him. Doug, great talented musician, and so in the meantime I was like, oh well, I'll just do the whole thing myself. Although the drums, I need a drummer, and so we brought in Jason. Oh God, why I'm suddenly blanking on Jason's last name, but he's the drummer for Neurosis, who are a big kind of heavy metal, not metal, they're kind of this in between, like really epic rock band, and he does almost all the drumming. Has done most, I'd say, 90% of the drumming for me, and he and I then played in the studio and just wrote everything. I'd written everything already, but we, worked together with me playing the bass so that the rhythm section was really tight. And then I went back through and laid all the guitars in and the, the organ and, all the stuff that makes it the Midnight Riders, So that's sort of the story. I mean, it really was, and it was really last minute, and it happened that's another Valve thing. We do things sometimes because we have no management, we can make really last minute changes. And this is one of those cases where we just jumped on it and all kind of ganged up, and then made this really interesting and different element that it just came together really fast. And I grew up in Montana, so like I know that kind of music is in my youth. I played that kind of music, so it was not a stretch for me.
Talking about how Valve is functioning like this, when there are no such, like, there's no hierarchy there's everyone's free, what other role other than being a music composer do you, like, if you weren't a music composer but you still are working at Valve, what position do you see yourself working at?
Well, I mean, I do a lot of programming, right? And so I enjoy that. I don't like to do it too much. I mean, sometimes I get really into it and I'll do it for a month or so. I do it pretty regularly, but like just doing that, I think I would go crazy just because of my artistic side. And I've done that in the past at other places, other jobs. But I think, I think I would probably get into more of game design, and maybe level design, kind of more of some of the skills I have from film. But there's also some really interesting stuff going on in other areas too, like Steam, right? And Steam is such an amazing platform, and I think there's a lot. Basically, at Valve, I tend to look for where can I be the most value? Like, how can I help out the most? And then kind of B, like, where's an area that I can really explore and maybe make value that way by, that there's some openings to create new ideas and I think Steam is, still, there's so many things that could happen with Steam.
Talking about Steam, one big aspect which because of it as it makes a platform for people, the workshop. People have also, Steam has made this available that now people can also upload their own soundtracks and stuff for games. What do you see as the future of this industry when the youth is so willing to participate in making music and making sounds for games itself, just as a hobby, not even as an occupation? Where do you see this going forward? I think, well, that's part of my talk today too, but I think I don't know. And that's the best part, right? Is that what I purposely, when after Portal 2, I composed all that music, and I really got a lot of high profile. And Valve, we don't give credits, like it's because
the truth is there's just as many people. How do I put that? There's a lot of people who have influenced or made that game more than me,
Okay.
and nobody knows who they are, right? And I think that's a really important thing to acknowledge, and people really want to know who did the music. I don't know why, but that's a thing. And so afterwards, I kind of was like, all right, I'm just going to help on some other projects, Dota and Counter-Strike Go. And so basically on Counter-Strike Go, I led the charge on the music, but I mostly did the implementation.
Okay.
And what I did is I looked at that concept of musicians and contributing, and because of our open structure, we have a hard time working with outside talent, right? Just because we really like to have people just contribute by organically,
Okay.
right? And to work with outside talent, you really need an interface, right? Just because there's a learning curve,
Okay.
and it can be really difficult if people don't learn and they don't fit, and it can be problematic. And so what I decided to do is design both of those games so that we could easily give a spec to an outside artist, a musician, and have them design a package that would easily plug in and that they would easily understand, right? And so that has been really interesting in two different ways. Counter-Strike, we've mostly reached out to professional musicians.
Okay.
There have been a few community contributions, and hopefully we'll do more of that in the future. I won't go into why we didn't go that route, but there are some pretty good reasons. Whereas Dota, we reached out to a handful of professionals, but then it's been almost entirely community-based. And both of them have been really successful. Deadmau5, who obviously is a professional, has publicly stated that he made more money from his Dota music pack than his last single, right? And that was one of the goals. We had two goals. Usually our goal is provide value to the customer. But in the case of the community thing, we really do try to make it so that we're providing value to the customer and the community, like the contributor, right? And I know there's been some interesting press around that recently, but I think in general, I think we've done a pretty good job of really trying to help the contributors. And they complain, there's problems. We're humans and we make mistakes, just like anybody. But I think we really, at one point, I remember I have so many of these experiences where I'll be with Gabe and he'll say something and I'll be like, I have no idea what you just said. And then a year later I'll be like, oh, I get it. I see, right? And I remember at one point he was like, I want people to be able to make money playing our games.
Yeah.
Right? That or at least they should get some value beyond the experience of playing the game. That we should, and that's where cards come from, right? Some of the trading cards.
Yeah.
And then contributor, user generated content, UGC, is part of that, which is if you're really into that universe and you want to create stuff and contribute to it, you get the value back of seeing other people use your stuff, and B, you actually get some money too, right? And so I think that's really interesting. And again, I covered that a little bit in my talk today too. Yeah, and I think there's a big future there. I think this is, I don't know, this is sort of me just thinking about the history. Once upon a time, novelists, right, were huge rock stars, right? And still we have some today. But then everybody was like, oh my God, I want to be the great American novelist. And so all of a sudden everybody was writing novels. And now we have, so many authors. There's so many authors. And yes, some are rock stars. But for the most part, there's just a lot of kind of middle class authors, right? And I think we'll see that with a lot of the arts going forward in the future because there's so many people.
All the music you've done, for Valve, it's always been you in the backgrounds. But the time you were on stage performing your rock band days, talking about them, because especially the band names itself, let's not go into the albums, the song titles. It's amazing to see the kind, because it cannot be said on a college broadcasting system, the names of the songs especially, but Steel Pole Bathtub, Duh,
Milk Cult?
Milk Cult, and then Tumor Circus. Just first of all, you started Steel Pole Bathtub along with a friend.
Yeah, with my friend Dale Flatham, who we grew up in a small town in Montana together, and we were living in Colorado and kind of poor, but we had money and a lot of time, and so we started a band there, and the name originally was the Steel Pole Bathtub Sour Boot Voodoo Milk Cult, right? And we'd make these posters and put them up for shows that weren't real, right? That we weren't. Nobody was. It just there wasn't even really a band yet, but it was kind of propaganda, and eventually we were like, okay, let's shorten it to Steel Pole Bathtub, and then later on when we did Milk Cult, we took that. So there's, whether there's Sour Boot Voodoo is the remaining, words from that original name. We're total art dorks. We're total nerds. But I can't speak for Dale, obviously, but for me, I'm a total art nerd, and that was a great time. We were young and really into things like William Burroughs, right, and all of his cut up, his techniques for creating things, and so. That name, I think, came from, we had a newspaper subscription. And, and we'd read the newspaper and then just throw it on the floor. And so our house slowly became filled with newspaper. And in our spare time, we would take scissors and cut letters and words out and then tape them on the walls. So the house was full of newspaper, which is probably not very safe. But then the walls were covered in words, in weird combinations of words. And I think that's where the Steel Pole Bathtub Sour Boot Voodoo Milk Cult came from originally. It was just kind of this weird collection of words taped to the wall. Our whole house was covered in newspaper print, and it was, again, art dorks,
The difference between when you're in a rock band where you're writing lyrics, you're writing songs, there's more ways of expressing yourself, to where music composition comes up in games, where amount of lyrics you have is very limited to none. Mm-hmm. So what all do you miss about writing songs like that and performing them on stage?
Yeah, exactly. I miss writing songs like that and performing them on stage. Yeah.
Is there a future where we can see you on stage again?
Probably. Yeah. I performed just recently with my engineer, Noah Landis, who also is in Neurosis. He's the keyboardist, and he has been doing all the engineering for me since TF2, the first TF2 piece, which is 12 years ago or somewhere around then, 11 years ago, and I have been asked a couple times to play solo, and I really enjoy that, and I tell stories, and it's kind of more of almost a story music combination thing, and recently he and I, my daughter playing violin, and then a really good friend, Jennifer Hall, playing drums, played at a festival headlined a night, and it was really fun. It was really good. We weren't good necessarily, but it was really fun, and I do enjoy, again, the kind of storytelling side of it, which music is not necessarily that great at. Like rock music, people often misunderstand the story as like a glorification. But I always use it as a story platform, and which is why soundtrack music makes sense for me too. Portal 2, I've met a few people who really understand the musical story, because there's a whole musical story that is complementary to the main story. And I don't publicly talk about it, because the writers, that they're like, what? I don't understand. And so I just kind of let people find it on their own. But I do like that kind of conceptual side where there's a lot of motifs, and if you kind of listen, you can tie them together and understand, I enjoy that too. They're both different. I think they'll come together maybe as I move towards doing some more actual performing, and, I'll do more composing, as opposed to Steel Pole Bathtub was very, we were really into playing, almost like jazz, like
Okay.
really improvisation and lots of noise, and we wrote everything together. Whereas I think this project will be more composed and letting everybody play their part, which is probably the best way to get a good performance out of somebody. Not out of them, but you
Yeah.
know what I'm saying. And so I'm looking forward to that part of it, is combining those two ideas together.
You've tried a lot of instruments. You know a lot of instruments. Have you ever tried or wanted to transition into something very Indian? Like, Indian instruments are very unique, very different, something which
Yeah.
hasn't been adopted by the Western culture yet.
Yeah.
Have you ever tried to incorporate them or wanted to incorporate them into such music compositions?
Yes, I was really interested in Indian music and instruments long time ago, like 1983.
Okay.
Back when I had to go to the library to get records, and but that made it so special because, like, it was like, what is this? And, reading the pamphlets, and you couldn't go online. Like, I had to get some books, and I haven't really studied it much since, because I haven't had a need or a context in which to do that. But I love, I really, really, especially like I was saying, Steel Ball Bathtub was very much about improvisation and self-expression.
Yeah.
And all three of us are self-expressing, which might be kind of a bit much at times, but I love that Indian tradition of, it's the musician's, I don't know, you probably have words for it, but like your interior
Yeah.
coming out through the music, and sort of the improvisation of the ragas and that sort of thing, I think is super interesting. And the sound of the instruments is beautiful in a dark way. Like, there's a dark beauty there that I
Okay.
think is really fantastic and really emotional. And I definitely have tried to make sounds that are similar with guitar in the past. And then there's a film that a friend of mine scored right before I made the switch. In fact, I talk about that in my talk too. And he had me come in and play acoustic guitar and electric guitar
Yeah.
and sitar, which he ended up using in this film. And sitar was so hard. It was so hard. I mean, I think I'd made enough that he was able to use some of it, but it was actually really difficult. But I love, the bending and the in-between notes and
Okay, yeah.
all that stuff I've always gravitated to that, and loved it. But I'm no expert. Like, I would love to actually spend some time understanding it better, for sure.
Not any more questions. Just a fan of rock music myself, and a fan of, like, a gamer who's played a lot of games, and I do listen to music. The one thing which stands out for me is the fact that in music, when it comes to singles and stuff, it survives for an amount of time.
Yeah.
And after that, it does die out until unless it's that iconic. The thing about which I get when you said that Team Fortress was like 12 years ago, and it hits me then that, but even like 5 to 10 years down the line, if the Team Fortress music hits, like if it plays somewhere, I
Right.
will recognize it. So, do you believe such platforms, which is a lot more interactive than when it comes to just music singles and performances, are they a better way of preserving music?
I think that's a really interesting point. I'd never thought about it that way, but not all of those. I'd say Team Fortress 2 and Left 4 Dead 1 and 2, both of those I really put a lot of thought into replayability, right? And so there's a lot of effort into trying to make motifs and concepts that you can hear over and over and over, and that don't make you crazy, right? Because if they have too much of a hook, they kind of can make you crazy.
Okay.
But at the same time, it's a really interesting thing because the study of kind of neurology and music says that the more familiar we are with something, the more we like it, right?
Yeah.
As long as it doesn't become too familiar. And that's the trick with making stuff that makes you crazy. And so I think what we're going to find is that, like, if you see a film, Like, okay, the Jaws theme. We all know the Jaws theme, right?
Yeah.
Just because it was so powerful, and it's been reiterated in, you know, or the Psycho, right? Those things have really been reiterated over and over, and so we're so familiar with them. They are really powerful. Whereas what we're going to see, I think, is a lot of game music will stick with people because they've spent 1,000 hours playing, you know, Dota or Team Fortress or whatever. And I'd never thought about it in terms of preserving music. I think that's really interesting.
That's all we have time for. It's fine.
Okay, great. Good, because I'm getting really sweaty.
That's fine.
Yeah.
Thank you for tuning in to Techniche Interviews 2017. I am Niranjan Abharti signing out.